We got him here. So it's been a great pleasure to really get to know Raj over the last 7 years. He is the director of the Thriving Earth Exchange, which is part of the American Geophysical Union, which I think you'll hear a lot about today during this presentation. Raj also chaired the National Academy's Committee on Designing Citizen Science to Support Science Learning, for which I was part of, and that was also just a lot of fun to be on that group. He serves on the boards of the Public Lab and the Anthropocene Alliance. He's a member of the Independent Advisory Committee on Applied Climatic Assessment, and he was a founding member of the Citizen Science Association and served as Education and Human Resource Commissioner for the American Meteorological Society. Before joining AGU, Raj led various groups connected to the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Also, he led an international research and development project using weather data to manage meningitis in Africa. He held a faculty position at Westchester State University and got his PhD from the University of Washington. And Raj now lives in Boulder. Yeah, one of my favorite cities. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Raj.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be here. This is an amazing place. It's a beautiful place. And it's very cool to be able to tell your parents you got invited to Cornell, even if it's a little bit later than they were hoping. So I actually want to start with a story, if I could. And it's a true story. It's about a young man who goes away to graduate school. And he comes home from graduate school and he sits down with his grandmother. And his grandmother says to him, "Grandson, tell me what you're learning in graduate school." And he sort of says, "Grandma, whoa, grad school's tough." And she's, "Grandson, tell me." So he takes a deep breath and he explains what he's doing in graduate school. And his grandmother pats him on the shoulder and she says, "This is good work, grandson. Go back to graduate school." So he goes back to graduate school. Comes back a year later, same thing. His grandmother says, "Tell me what you've learned in graduate school." And it's a little bit more complicated. He's a little more into it, but he does it. He takes a deep breath, he explains it. His grandmother pats him on the shoulder and says, "Grandson, this is good work. Go back to graduate school." He goes back, comes back a year later, and this time he doing Fortran coding, writing numerical models. It's a true story, by the way. And his grandmother, and he just puts his foot down. He says, "You know what, Grandma, I'm sorry, I can't explain what I'm doing. It's really technical, it's very detailed. There are words we use in graduate school that I don't even know how to translate into the language you and I share." And his grandmother pats him on the shoulder and says, "Grandson, don't go back to graduate school. If what you're doing can't be translated into our language, how can it be useful to our people?" And it's a true story. I tell that story because I want you to imagine a different way of thinking about graduate school, of thinking about science. What if instead of going away to graduate school and coming home to say what he had learned, what if he had asked his grandma and her peers what she was interested in, what she was concerned about, what was going on in their community? And what if he had used his role in graduate school to be a bridge between those two worlds and connect those two kinds of knowledge? What if he'd even designed his research in partnership with his grandmother and her community? That's the idea of that's the core idea of community science, and that's what I want to talk about today. Before I do that, I want to say that a lot of what you're hearing is the work of many, many people I've had the honor and the privilege of collaborating with. In fact, I think it's fair to say that all of the good things you're going to hear today are their work, and I contributed the rest. So, the title of my talk, From Doing Science For to Doing Science With: The Promise of Working with Community-Based Organizations. And just to give you a little bit of a heads up, this is an outline or a graph of the course of the talk. So it starts off, if optimism is the vertical axis and time is the horizontal axis, I'm warning you now, we're going to take a crash. All right? If I were a typical climate scientist, we would stop there. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to actually think about how things can get better. And if any of you have ever seen Kurt Vonnegut graph stories, that's where I stole this idea. So, So let's start with the bad stuff. Science has been misused to destroy nature. This is a picture taken by Teresa Dardar at the extreme southern tip of New Orleans, or of Louisiana. It's an area called Pointe-aux-Chênes. There is a history here that's revealed in this picture. The trees there are the remnants of a cypress forest that used to dominate the landscape. That was logged. That's what remains. Once those trees were gone, oil was discovered. And so there was a crisscross of oil canals. At the same time, there was an invasive species called the nutria that came over on ships. Turns out nutria love marsh grass. After you destroy the trees and build canals, all that's left to hold the landscape together is marsh grass. Now you've got the nutria, and then you have climate change. All of that contributes and is a background to a global scale subsidence such that this area is losing land at the rate of a football field a day. This community is having to relocate. So science, in this case, is complicit in a stream of events that have led to the degradation of this natural landscape and the loss of these people's homes. It's been used to protect privilege. This is a picture right before Hurricane Sandy, right before it came on shore in New York City. Notice there's one building that's lit up. Anybody want to know what that building is? Anybody know what that building is? It's Goldman Sachs, right? This is the place where resources were deployed, where backup power generators were used to protect privilege. It's been used to enhance inequity. This is a place close to my grandfather's neighborhood in Mumbai. It's one of the largest impermanent settlements in the world, also called a slum. That water pipe that this little girl is walking on is carrying water through this neighborhood into one of the most expensive areas of real estate on the planet, a place where the average rent is higher than Manhattan. None of the people living in this area have access to water. And there's something really jarring about the juxtaposition of a scientific and technological solution to replace a natural system that's been so degraded that it can't provide resources for the people around it. That's a stream. It doesn't look like a stream, but it's a stream. And unless you think this was only happening internationally, it's happening right here in the United States. For me, the wake-up call was Hurricane Katrina, a well-forecast storm in the short term. Scientists, meteorologists were able to predict the track of that storm 3 days in advance and issue large-scale warning. It was also a well-forecast disaster in the long term. We had known for a long time that the evacuation plans were inadequate, that the levees weren't designed for the category of storm that was likely to happen. At least 20 years of advance warning. And we saw the burden of the storm disproportionately affecting people of color, communities without substantial resources. And as a scientific community, we have two possible responses to this kind of thing. One response is to say, our job is to do the science, our job is to predict a storm. And that's where our responsibility ends. Another response, and I think a better response, is to think about our role as human beings on the planet and the knowledge and the gifts we have as scientists and how they can be part of preventing things like this from happening again. Martin Luther King said, our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. And the simple message for me is that science can't be done in isolation. Science doesn't have an inherent moral purpose. It can be used for good or bad. It derives its moral guidance from its connection to and its participation in a larger society and its work with communities and all communities. Another incidental point that I think is worth making is that one of the lessons of civil rights is that individual achievement doesn't excuse systemic biases. And I think that's a lesson that needs to be incorporated into the way we think about diversity and equity in science. And so I'll try to unpack that as well. So how did this happen? We're getting sort of toward the bottom of that curve now, in case you were wondering. I think there's been a separation that's created gaps. Science is a little isolated and increasingly getting more isolated from a rapidly changing America and even a rapidly changing the world. That isolation looks like the places we do science, specialized labs. The fact that we're in this beautiful institution when other people don't have access to this kind of institution. That's a barrier that isolates science from a larger set of concerns. The tools we use to do science have become expensive, they've become remote, they're distance from the places people live, and the people who do science don't reflect the diversity of the United States or the diversity of the world. That's an especially onerous problem in a peer review system, because if people are deciding on what are the scientific priorities and they're all coming from a minority of the population, it's hard to understand how those scientific priorities that are invested in can represent the diversity of concerns, issues, and priorities in the population as a whole. That isolation also becomes sort of a kind of polar vortex. Sorry, maybe that's not the best analogy to use, but in that isolation, we start to develop our own cultures and our own norms, and those cultures and norms can further isolate us from things. So for example, in a scientific meeting, it is perfectly okay to stand up and tell the speaker they're full of crap and they don't know anything. It turns out that's not really well regarded outside the scientific community. Right? Another example of this is scientists have the ability to disregard the messenger completely and focus on the message. That's not something that's widely shared. In fact, in many forms of communication, evaluation of the messenger is as important as the message. Does that make sense? I think all of it stems back to this loading dock model, this Vannevar Bush idea that the investment in basic research will produce benefit for society and for the world without the basic researchers having to take any responsibility for that benefit. It's been called the loading dock model, the idea that we'll do a bunch of science, we'll put it out there, it's up to society to pick that science up and decide how to use it. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that different people have different kinds of access to the loading dock. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that decisions about what kind of science to do are inherently tied up to what gets produced for the loading dock. And it doesn't acknowledge the fact that the loading dock is in fact a position of privilege. That's been the dominant modality of thinking about science funding in the United States since World War II. Vannevar Bush actually went before Congress and said, I can't tell you for sure which investments will pay off, but I'm pretty sure investment will pay off. And it's sort of astounding to me that he got away with that logic and was able to fund scientific research for as long as he was. So we need a new approach. We need an additional approach. And I want to be clear here that I'm not arguing against basic research. I'm arguing for more attention to the entire scope of scientific activity, not only basic research. We tend to prioritize and celebrate basic research. I think we sometimes do it at the expense of the other aspects of doing science. So I'm really talking about an additional approach. And the exciting thing is that additional approach is happening right here at Cornell, right here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. This is the project I've had the privilege of being involved with. This is sort of the reason I think that I got invited here, which is kind of cool. This is the Noise Project. And what's fundamental about the Noise Project is the very top line, equitable approaches for co-created scientific research from the ground up. That's one of, and this isn't just, this is happening here. Cornell is at the vanguard of it, but it's happening all over. I don't know what to call this. These are all the potential possible names I've heard for this. I like to call it community science. It's the idea of doing science in partnership with communities, engaging in every step of a process of science, from defining a scientific question to deciding what counts as research, to using that research to make a difference as partners, as equals. It's also engaging with humility, understanding that science is only a piece of the activity in which you're engaging, and it's only a part of the puzzle. It's not the whole answer. Those two ideas are at the core of community science. And if you imagine going to grad school with that in your head, you might have a very different kind of conversation with your grandmother. So some of the advantages, I think, of community science are that it brings new perspectives and new ideas into science, and it brings them in an authentic and inquiry-based way so that they're part of framing new kinds of scientific questions and scientific research. An example of this might be when women started entering the field of evolutionary biology in large numbers, and suddenly people were paying attention to the role of females in mate selection, whereas up until then it had been dominated by this paradigm that the men made all the choices. It also allows new people to have access to asking scientific questions. A great example of that is during the AIDS movement, when AIDS activists actually insisted on the right to help frame a research agenda around the AIDS virus. They fought tooth and nail for this opportunity. They had to, but they did. And it was literally nothing less than a matter of survival. It opens up people to the joy of science in a very real way. Pedagogically, we know that one of the best techniques, actually, the National Academies of Science just released a study. They are able to conclusively say that inquiry-based approaches are more effective science education techniques than anything else. Community science is at heart nothing more than co-created inquiry. So it's an incredible educational possibility. And the final thing is community science, even if you don't care about anything, it's good for science. When a community member advocates before Congress about the value of a partnership with science, that has the potential to fund all scientific research, including basic research. I had an editor at a journal say to me once, I get this community science, I wouldn't want to be involved, but it's important that somebody be involved. I can live with that. That seems like a victory. And then the last thing is, I used to work at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, as Tina mentioned. Our director, the founding director, used to say that science is a privilege, and in exchange for that privilege, we have a responsibility to contribute to society. That's especially true at a taxpayer-funded institution like the one we were at. So those are the reasons for doing community science. Let me walk you through some examples and some suggestions about how to do it. I'm going to first talk about suggestions for what it means for scientists, and then I'm going to take it up a level because I'm interested in the scale problem and think about what it might mean for an institution, a place like Cornell. So this is a lesson I've learned from the Noise Project. There's a tendency to believe that science has the opportunity to save a community, that we can go into a community and we can tell them the thing they need to know to make their community better. I would suggest that a better approach is to respect community knowledge and respect communities' knowledge about their own communities and what they need to make it better. This is an example of what that looks like. This was a project in Africa. It was around, it was a project I was part of at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And our premise in the project was that Africa needed better weather forecasting. We were weather forecasters. So we were pretty convinced Africa needed better weather forecasters. We went to Africa, we spent time in Ghana, and people over and over told us that weather wasn't their primary concern. Health was their primary concern. In particular, meningitis was their primary concern. My initial reaction was, I know nothing about meningitis. But people who lived there did. They knew that meningitis only was a problem during the dry season, and that once the rains came, meningitis transmission ended. It ended naturally. That was the beginning of a research project that looked at how we could connect weather information to healthcare providers so they could allocate vaccine based on the oncoming monsoon and target the vaccine to areas where the monsoon was delayed and the meningitis risk was higher, and away from areas where there was natural rainfall that would end the monsoon. Fundamentally about respecting local knowledge and autonomy about what people know and what they want to achieve. Building on that theme of autonomy, one of the things we hear sometimes from scientists, one of the things the ICBO program, or from community members, one of the things the ICBO program has learned is that people are tired of being used for studies and they're tired of promises. Institutions come, talk to people, and leave with projects halfway done. What does halfway done look like? Here's an example from a project in Denver that we were involved with. The community was interested in understanding health, community health again. In this case, they were interested in environmental factors that contributed to health. They were interested in air and water pollution. This was a region, and this is why the dry cleaning picture is there, where several dry cleaning businesses had gone out of business. And dry cleaning businesses used a chemical that would sometimes spill. It was a really toxic chemical that would leach into soil, enter the groundwater, travel throughout the neighborhood, outgassing people's basements. So our project, co-designed, was to measure that outgassing in people's basements. And the research stopped there, but the community said, no, wait, you can't measure people's basements and walk away. What are you going to do to the family that finds out that their home has this in it? How are they going to remediate this? How are you going to deal with property value implications? What's the plan? And so the researchers sat down with the community leaders. Together, they designed a plan to go to city council and combine the testing for this chemical with testing for radon, which meant that the homeowners would be eligible for funding to radon remediate. The backstory there is every home in Denver has a radon problem. So we were pretty sure we'd find a radon problem, which would allow them to apply for the funds that would also remediate the chemical problem. That's the difference between doing a project that stops at research and carrying it all the way to impact. And it's a responsibility of scientists, I believe, to respect that kind of community autonomy and those broader community goals and connect their research to those broader goals. I also think we have to respect community history and tradition. Science has been used on people. It's been done to people. Lately, we've been getting better. We only do it at people. But there are communities who feel like science is a thing that has been used against them and has been part of a legacy of oppression. And we need to understand that. We need to embrace that. And we need to understand the history of that. And we need to use that history to move forward. And an example of that came from a project I worked on with Kareem, who's came over from another department, so thank you. And this is a project in the Pamir Mountains. So this is a region, it's a very mountainous region, and people who live in this region have traditional calendars that they've used to guide agricultural practice. They're not astronomical calendars. They aren't counting days after the year or solar events. They're ecological calendars. They look at what's happened when a species, when a plant has bloomed or when a bird arrives, and then they count forward from that to guide agricultural practice. Those calendars weren't used for decades. They weren't used in the western controlled areas of the Pamir Mountain because this was an area that was rife with global conflict because it was a pawn in a larger power struggle. They weren't used in the eastern areas because there was a push towards mechanized and standard agriculture. But the people in this region were recovering and documenting those calendars. And as they were doing that, they were recognizing that in the last 50 years, the calendars aren't static. These kinds of calendars evolve against constant observation and interaction with the environment when they're allowed to. When you don't have the opportunity to do that for 50 years, the calendars stagnate and the environment moves on, especially quickly now because of climate change. So they found that their calendars didn't match events around them, and they wanted to bring them back into agreement. So they reached out to scientists and asked for climate scientists to help them access scientific knowledge to recalibrate their traditional calendars. And what I love about that project is it positions science not as the dominant worldview, but as a partner in a bigger worldview, an older worldview, a traditional worldview. And I actually lost a board member on this project because they didn't understand why we were supporting something that, quote unquote, wasn't scientific. And they couldn't see the connection between indigenous empirical-based knowledge systems and scientific empirical-based knowledge systems. Still hurts a little. And then finally, I heard this morning, and I thought this was really well said. Bias is the default. We live in a society where inequity, racism, structural issues are the default. And unless science tackles those head on, it becomes complicit in advancing that kind of inequity. So it's a responsibility of scientists not just to think about their science in isolation, but to think about how it connects to these larger issues of social justice. So what does that look like? Here's a project in Houston. This is where this kid plays every day. The factories on the side are how people in this neighborhood experience science. They know that these factories are venting at night when the monitors are off. They know that these factories are able to decide and look at the prevailing winds and know when it's okay to vent because the winds will blow it away from the EPA monitoring station that they have to be in compliance with. They wanted to work with a scientist to design their own monitoring program that they could use to supplement the EPA's monitoring. This was the first time they felt like science was part of their solution set instead of part of the problem set that was posed against them. And I think the lesson for me is that science should be a fundamental human right, that all communities deserve the opportunity to participate in, guide, and benefit from science. And this is how you do that. You do this by designing explicitly for equity. And I think that's enough, actually. I'm gonna move on. Suggestions for institutions. So one of the things I will say is that there are heroes doing this work all over. There are heroes in public health, there are heroes in ecological research, there are heroes in fishery, there are heroes here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And part of what makes them heroic is they're doing it in spite of a system that isn't designed to support this kind of work. What I think is amazing is the opportunity to think about how we nudge the system, how we tweak the system, how we redesign the system while we're in it to do this kind of work. And so that's where I want to transition now, is to what can an institution like Cornell do to enable and support this kind of work. So one is we can broaden the definition of success. Traditional models of tenure, traditional ideas of tenure emphasize research productivity. I've been at an institution, 2 institutions now, where they've used Boyer's model of scholarship, which posits that there are 4 aspects of doing science: research, education, application, and synthesis, rather than just 1, research. And they've been able to redo their tenure system to better evaluate contributions across the range of scientific activities. And these tenure systems are working. They're tenuring people who might not have gotten tenure under the old system, and they're redefining what it means to be successful. And they're also broadening the pool of people who want to work in these institutions. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is enable networks. Traditional hierarchies allow ideas to bubble up. They don't allow ideas to emerge. They don't allow things to restructure. One thing this might look like is something that's happening at an institution in Arizona right now, Arizona State University. In addition to the traditional departments, they've created problem-oriented solution spaces where people from different departments come together to tackle overarching societal issues that require a broad range of expertise. One of the things I've noticed in community science is that when you work with a community, you're automatically entering an interdisciplinary or a transdisciplinary space. Community priorities don't map onto traditional scientific disciplines perfectly. So this is pulling us in this direction. It's up to institutions to be able to have the nimbleness and the flexibility to accommodate that. I think it means moving from old-fashioned hierarchical systems to much more flexible systems of shared power, shared authority, and shared decision-making. I think we also have to invest in community partnerships. I want to highlight some of the community partnerships that are part of the ICBO that's here. These are just some of the community groups that this team is working with. And these are relationships that are nurtured over time. That needs to happen at an individual level. At an institutional level, we need to build organizational partnerships that allow those kinds of relationships to scale. One of the things we've done at the institution I'm at, the American Geophysical Union, is we've built partnerships between our science society and organizations that serve different kinds of communities. So we've got a partnership with the International County Managers Association, a partnership with the National League of Cities, a partnership with the Environmental Justice Health Alliance. What these partnerships do is they create opportunities for us to meet communities and for us to introduce our members to local community groups in their neighborhoods, in the places they live, that they could potentially partner with. So building those kinds of organizational partnerships can enable the kind of deep personal relationships that are the foundation of this. And I think it's totally legit to ask your institution to be building those kinds of partnerships to enable this kind of work. Okay, this is where I'm going to get a little ornery. But one of the things I hear sometimes is community science is really hard. It takes a long time. You have to invest a lot of energy in it. All those things are true, but you know what? Numerical modeling is hard. Chemistry is hard. It isn't the question of whether it's hard, it's the question of whether we're willing to invest the resources to do it. Chemistry, bench chemistry is enabled in universities because universities make a commitment to providing bench chemistry laboratories and providing tenured faculty with startup packages to build those laboratories. We can do the same thing for community science if we choose to. We need to start to think about our institutions in ways that can enable community science. So some of that is physical infrastructure. Do we create spaces that are welcoming for communities? Do we design our institutions not only for basic science, but for applied science? Do we build technology that facilitates people's participation? This is one of the reasons I'm so excited about citizen science, is it suddenly takes things that you used to have $30,000 instruments to be able to do, and it puts it back in the hands of something that almost anyone can access. Almost. We need to think carefully about that almost. We also need to provide structures, intellectual structures to engage in this work. We need to provide frameworks. We need to provide ethical principles. What does it mean to engage with the community ethically? How does this institution value that responsibility? How does this institution honor that commitment? Those things need to be part of the guiding principles that are part of the institution. In the same way we have an institutional review board, we need a community science board to offer best practices in community science. And again, pulling from some of the work I've learned with the ICBO, they're starting to develop these. And of course, this isn't going to surprise anybody. There's a right way to develop these and a wrong way to develop these. A wrong way would be for Cornell and the administrators at Cornell to go lock themselves in a room and come up with principles for community work. That's not what the ICBOs have done. That's not what this project has done. They've sat down in partnership with community organizations and developed a list together of principles that will guide their work. And I think that's part of the responsibility of an institution like this. And then finally, we need to teach community science. Nobody learns this in, well, that's not true. There are fields in which this is learned, but they're not as common as they could be. So taking what we can from fields where they're really good at community science and starting to share that and build that into the graduate curriculum. This looks like courses in ethics, courses in social responsibility, courses in justice, courses in history. All of these things can be incorporated into a science education. Even reflection on the epistemological foundations of science. I sort of just like saying that because it makes me sound smart. But I have a friend who talks about the assumed epistemological superiority of science as one of the biggest barriers to broadening participation. Right? I managed to go to graduate school and get a degree in science without ever having to think about the epistemological nature of science and how it relates to other ways of knowing. That seems like a mistake. And that's a mistake we can prevent going forward. I think being open, being able to approach your science with humility should be a skill that we develop in graduate school for scientists. And I think it opens the grounds for scientific research. And then finally, there's some really pragmatic things we need to do better. We need to share funding. This is an example of, this is that project in Denver. They decided to raise money for their project. They were going to use a Kickstarter campaign. The cool thing about that was they shared all of the resources. The resources were equally split between the scientific investigator and the community leads. The second cool thing about it was they raised the money from the people in the neighborhood. So they were beholden not to some distant funder, but to the actual community they were working in. That was where their point of responsibility was. And that was a conscious choice. And I think we need to explore funding models like this. I said it was a Kickstarter project. Interestingly enough, it really wasn't. It was from a site called experiment.com, which was founded by a group of graduate students who were so frustrated with getting research dollars that they decided to create a Kickstarter for science. And they've since launched something like 300 different projects. It's kind of a cool site. If you get a chance, you should check it out. And then finally, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing we can do is share power. Recognize that in the words of my former, well, he was never my director, but the founding director of the lab I was at, science is a privilege. Being able to do science comes with a certain kind of cachet. And we have a responsibility to use that privilege to do good in the world. One of the films I watched with my daughter when she was young was called The Princess Diaries. Anybody who's seen it? There's a scene in that movie where the princess says, I don't want to go be a princess. It's a young girl who lives in San Francisco who discovers she's a princess. And they invite her to come back and be the princess in this town. And she tells her best friend, I don't want to do it. I don't want to go back. Who am I? I'm just some person. And her best friend says, no, you have an opportunity not just to be a princess, but to use that princesses to do good. And what this movie that I watched with my 7-year-old daughter taught me was that privilege isn't the problem necessarily. The problem is how you use that privilege. So acknowledge the fact that we have that privilege and think about how we can use that privilege not to accumulate more privilege, but to share and to contribute to other people having access and opportunities. Let me sum it up. Bottom line, if you take one thing home, it's that I'd like you to think about moving from designing for to designing with. This is a project in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and it was another community like the one I showed you in Bombay, where people were living in impermanent housing, this one on the banks of a river. The river would flood periodically, and so there was a big investment to try to protect people in this region from flooding. They held community meeting after community meeting after community meeting, discussed things like walls, discussed things like moving everybody out of the floodplain. Someone noticed that in most of the community meetings, women weren't speaking. So they held a women's only community meeting, and that's what this is a picture of. In this women's only community meeting, the women said, flooding isn't the problem. It's always flooded here. We know how to deal with flooding. The problem is that in the last 10 years, when it floods, raw sewage comes into our homes with the floodwater. The climate change adaptation that came out of that discussion ended up being latrines. I think it shows the power of attending to equity. I think it shows the power of recognizing community knowledge. I think it shows the power of positioning science not as the goal, but as a means to a community goal. Remember, this project was originally about climate change. And yet the climate change folks involved were able to see how they could attend to climate change by contributing more to a community priority. And finally, this project is about having the humility to be part of a conversation and offer your science as a skill that can add to a community knowledge store and be a partner with that community. This is a picture by Chris Jordan. He's an American artist living in Seattle. It looks like trees. As you walk closer and closer, you realize it's stacks and stacks of paper bags. It's about 1.4 million paper bags, which represents the number of paper bags that are thrown away in the US every, anybody want to guess? Day, a little bit lower. Hour, every hour, 1.4 million paper bags. And this is a view of humanity that sort of wonders if we're a problem. Wonder if having 1.4 million people or 1.4 million paper bags thrown away is a problem of humanity. We have 9 billion people on this planet. We're going to max out at something like 10.5. Can we really sustain it? People pointed this out to Chris, that this was kind of a pessimistic view of the world, so he created another picture. This is one called E Pluribus Unum. It looks like a mandala. As you walk closer and closer to this, it resolves into words. Those words resolve into the names of 1 million different organizations around the world that are devoted to environmental justice, indigenous rights, and social justice. 1 million different organizations. This is a fundamentally different view of humanity. This is a view of humanity that says not 9 billion people destroying the planet by throwing away paper bags, but 9 billion potential partners in building the kind of just and equitable world we want to build. Those are our partners in community science. And that's the vision of the world I'd like to ask you to embrace and help create. So thank you.
I also want to acknowledge a lot of what Raj was mentioning with respect to the ICBOs is really the child of Karen Purcell and Marilu Lopez back there. So I also want to acknowledge them and their work. Raj will be here all day. He's pretty booked up for this afternoon. You may have some time tomorrow morning if you want to meet with him one-on-one. We're also going to have a very informal lunch in Kingfisher. If you want to come and join us for lunch, you're more than welcome to. You got to bring your own lunch, sorry. But for 15 minutes or so, if anyone has questions.
I want to amplify that last point. I sort of am the messenger, but I didn't create the message. I'm really relaying things that I've learned from a lot of different people, and two of the people I've learned a lot from are Mary Lou and Karen. And I've only been working on this project for a couple of months, and I've already learned an enormous amount. They've invested time and energy, and I think it's safe to say that if you're looking for leaders in this field of community science, you have them here in this institution. And also now, if you ask a question, I'll just tell you to talk to them. So what questions do you have? Yes.
So for one thing that I've noticed is in the design-based thinking and projects, a lot of components, not like they're naturally built in, but it provides a framework how to flow a little bit. So how do you see that in kind of the overall movement? So, for example, in the microprogram in Chile, they had a competition to assign at the time they had a coastal area. And so they had, environmental engineers, they wanted, and the problem was that there's so much feedback. And that kind of design process that those you always have to think, who are you getting feedback from? They facilitated it. It was pretty neat that the last time everybody voted out of the science and they voted and decided this is the design and criticized the pushing for the community to decide what we want and attack it now. How much of that can please in the design?
Yeah, I think you're so first, yes. These ideas of human-centered design are I think this core idea of working with people and honoring what they bring to the table and looking for ways to bring lots of different skills together and iterating constantly and always be willing to sort of look for fallibility and improve and accept the imperfection of the process. I think those ideas are fundamental to whether it's good design. In software engineering, it's called agile development. In development, like the world of philanthropy, there's a notion of they've been on this co-creation kick a lot longer than us. Climate scientists are starting to wake up to it. I was sort of joking about them, but the truth is, like, we've designed a lot of climate science to understand the climate system, not to help people make decisions. And then we're frustrated that people don't make decisions. Like, maybe there's a relation between the two. I do think this core idea is showing up in it's showing up in science education. So I think one of the interesting opportunities is to bring all of these different conversations together around this core idea of collaborative co-design or whatever. I'm not sure. I really don't know what to call it because it has so many different names in different fields. But I think we're all discovering something together. Thank you. That was a long answer. I'm sorry. I promise to be shorter next question. What else?
Yes. Raj, institutions of higher education tend not to be among the most nimble and adaptable organizations out there. And I'm curious if you could expand a bit on the Arizona State example. What exactly they're doing and how you think other academic institutions could adapt.
Yeah, so a couple of things, a couple of thoughts on this. One is there's a whole landscape of institutions of higher education, and there are actually institutions of higher education that are amazing at this. tribal colleges are really good at this kind of community-based work. A lot of historically Black colleges are amazing at this kind of work. And one of the things that I think is exciting about this work is it's an opportunity to finally recognize those talents that have been under-recognized. So how cool would it be to have Stanford learning from Jackson State, right? That's an opportunity here. So that's one thing I would say is some higher institutions have been doing this. Another thing I would say is this was pointed out to me by a friend of mine. College presidents get this. They understand the value and the connection between what they do in their institution and the community. They depend on that at some fundamental level. Individual faculty often get this, right? Where it breaks down is the incentive system in the middle. So, and interesting thing about college faculty is they kind of control the incentive system in the middle. So Lori Leshin, who is the president of a university, asked her faculty senate to revise tenure guidelines, and they did. And that, it took 7 years, so you're right, it's not nimble. But the point was that faculty are one of the weirdest jobs in the world where you get to both decide what the rules are and evaluate other people on those rules. And so you actually, in faculty systems, you have a lot of power. And I guess, you know, there's that phrase, we've met the enemy and it is us. I think it's easy to sort of look at the administrators and say they're standing in the way, but the truth is a lot of faculty have a lot of power. How do we mobilize ourselves around this idea? Another piece I'll say is that I meet a lot of people who are excited about this work, but it's like they sort of keep it hidden because they're afraid it won't be respected. One of the things we can do is create a space for those people to acknowledge what they do and find each other, and that can be part of the answer to how we mobilize the institutions, I think. Those would be my answers. Yes, sir.
So you talked about the epistemology of science as well, and I heard a lot about power and a lot about incentives. And I wonder if there's a danger too along the way to lose track of the science for the sake of knowledge, or knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And some of the great scientists throughout history have been those searching for the knowledge for the sake of knowledge rather than seeking for life. Where it just fits in as well.
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question. I think it's a good point. I get pretty excited about this, and I think about it as sort of the undervalued part of science. And I apologize because sometimes when I do that, I think I inadvertently devalue some of that too. I think we need both. I think we absolutely need both. And I think we've veered a little bit too much on the basic science side at the expense of celebrating and rewarding the applied or the co-created, that kind of work. I will say I don't think it's a zero-sum game either. I think that if we do this work well, we build support for science, all kinds of science, including basic research. So, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that this has a lot of potential for education.
Yeah.
And that made me think of not just, graduate level research, but undergraduate and even K-12 education. It seems like schools could be a place where a class can kind of almost lead away on some of these projects to talk to their community and figure out what kind of an inquiry-based investigation. But I feel like the schools and informal education organizations as well have the same kind of lack of independence that you've been discussing with higher education institutions. And because everyone's busy teaching the test or whatever other structural things.
Yeah.
So how do we deal?
Really, that's a great question. It's funny, we were talking about this before. So some of it is I think there's a there's a fundamental assumption of deficit that undermines a lot of our educational system, right? A lot of education is about kids who need to be filled up with knowledge because they don't have a lot on their own. And so that's one piece. Another piece is I think it can be a very uncomfortable position for someone in charge of a classroom to be willing to sort of let go of some of that control. Not only because it's letting go of control, because it's also potentially taking them outside their expertise, the place where they feel comfortable, right? So, so those are kind of the social pieces and we just need to help people wrap their heads around it. We need to give them opportunities to practice. We need to think about how teacher education works. On the other side, I think there's effort with like the national standards and the NGSS to really move away from some of the traditional drivers of science education and towards emphasizing more of these kinds of skills, attitudes, motivations, and inquiry. And I think that can provide a way for some teachers to be able to incorporate this in their classroom. We also just have to acknowledge that this is going to take time. And we need to invest the time and energy in that. Yes.
So some of the work that you're talking about here, where we are now with the Noise Project and with the ICBOs, which by the way stands for Independent Community-Based Organizations.
Sorry, thank you.
Some of it is, I don't want to say it's the culmination, because I hope it will go on and on and on and on, but right now it's sort of where we are after a 30-year trajectory. Beginning with our national science experiments, or actually back in 1965 with the Instructor Card program, where the fundamental reason that we work with the public was to gather data, because we need data to understand bird populations. And we looked upon the public, which is impossible to define, as a partner that could help be the eyes and ears of scientists. When we went to the National Science Foundation in 1990 to up the ante and say, give us millions of dollars to do this work, which eventually we started calling citizen science, there was nothing in there about community, really very little about education. Some education in college, but it was really much more about getting the data. It was the National Science Foundation that told us in 1990, this is a great idea, it's to go far if you can work with all audiences, including underserved urban audiences, which is how Project Didn't Watch was invented. But even when we started Project Didn't Watch, the whole idea was to get data. In this case, it was about pigeons. I'm not going to go into why we wanted to know that right now, but the whole idea was data. And we did the funding for that. But the director of the lab at the time, Charlie Walcott, measured the success of Project Didn't Watch in data. That's it. There was nothing about any kind of measuring community learning. And even as we progressed from that grant after grant after grant to where we are now, I'm going to pick on the director of the lab, we got to yesterday. I'm going to pick on him for just a minute, and he would be fine. He knows I do this. This is okay. He is still saying to me and Karen, okay, but are these groups sending in any data? And that is not what this is about. This is really about building up a community where we have mutual respect and understanding for the many ways of thinking about science and what science can do. But that's created a huge tension at the Lab of Ornithology. Because the truth is, we wouldn't have done any of this work. The lab has never invested a penny in any of it. It's all come from grants that we've received from NSF, but from other places as well. And the lab has always said, great, because we brought in $3, $4, $5 million in overhead costs. So why would they say not to do this work? But as we continue to do this work, we're now starting to agitate and saying the lab needs to think about diversity in the community in a whole new way. It's not just about data. But this is creating a fundamental tension here at the lab. And I have no idea what the rest of the other is going to be. But it's going to be really interesting to see where all this goes in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And this is, I want to say quickly, this isn't the only place where the lab is doing this work. We've got the Elephant Listening Program. A lot of the work that NAND is doing now in Central America really is very very much into the community. And a lot of the work that we've done in our education program has been very respectful of that as well. But it's still just a huge tension that our strategic plan, our board, our directors are going to have to come to terms with what is our goal, what are our objectives, and how do we measure them. Let me just tell you one of my favorite stories. There's still 2 minutes left. When we did the first pilot project, the early pilot projects with Pigeon Watch, I remember I was working at the school in Orlando at the time. And I went and I called the teacher and I said, "You did your first Pigeon Watch observation today, right?" "Yep." I said, "It was fantastic. What did you learn? What did the students learn?" She said, "We learned that all of our pigeons are called." And this was just monumental for the teacher, for the students, for that part of Orlando. Birds are, they're not all pigeons, right? And I can't measure that, right? But I can tell you that it was eye-opening. And this kind of thing is still going. So again, I don't have an answer here, but I just want to point out that this tension is going to be very uncomfortable for many more years here and also at the greater Cornell.
Yeah. The only comfort I can offer you maybe is that I think we're actually at a cusp, right? For a lot of reasons. I think we're starting to rethink the traditional role of institutions, of education, of doing science, and rethink kind of the motivation and the purpose. And there's historical lessons we can learn. There's historical examples we can look back to. Cornell is a land-grant college. It's that is a service orientation, and I think it's part of a landscape of pretty big change that's happening. When I work with young people and when I work with all people, I'm excited about the potential for what this looks like in 20 years when we get through it and we're dealing with the next tension. I really do think we're going to be seeing a pretty fundamental difference in how we think about what it means to be a science person and what it means to do science and who we do it with and how we do it. And I think that's, like, I feel lucky to be around to witness that kind of transition. Hopefully that's a little hopeful.
I'm more.
Well, thank you, everyone.